He was a beggar, not a fallen nobleman, not a displaced general, not the son of anyone who had ever mattered. Zhu Yuanzhang was born so poor that when his parents died, of plague, of starvation, within days of each other, his family had no burial shrouds, no cloth, nothing. He wrapped them in straw, dug with his hands, buried them in a field that did not belong to him, and walked away alone at 16 years old. That boy, that beggar, that orphan, that monk who starved in a monastery and wandered the roads of China with nothing would become the man who ended it. 100 years of Mongol rule, gone, not by a great dynasty reclaiming its throne, not by a general born to power, by a man who had owned nothing, lost everything, and decided somewhere along the road that enough was enough. The Mongols had ruled China since 1271. They had conquered it under Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, the man who had made the entire world afraid. For nearly a century, the Yuan dynasty had sat on the dragon throne, governed the most populous nation on earth, commanded armies that had once broken kingdoms from Poland to Persia. And in 1368, a beggar threw them out. This is not a story about dynasties rising and falling. This is a story about where power actually comes from and what it costs the man who takes it. If history was taught like this in school, none of us would have skipped class. Welcome to *The Clash of Ancients. Subscribe, new empires fall every week. And tell me right now in the comments, did you know the man who ended Mongol rule in China was once a homeless beggar? Yes or no? Here is what most people get wrong about the fall of the Mongols in China. They imagine a great final battle, 2 armies, a decisive engagement, the Mongol Empire broken on a battlefield by Ming steel and Ming courage. That is not what happened. The Mongols fell the way most empires fall, from the inside, slowly, over decades, long before the armies arrived. By the time Zhu Yuanzhang's forces marched north, the Yuan dynasty was not a functioning empire. It was the memory of one. And understanding why requires going back, not to the battlefield, but to the throne room, and to what a century of ruling China had done to the men who sat in it. Kublai Khan had been a genius, not merely a conqueror, though he was that. He had understood something that his grandfather Genghis had not needed to understand. That ruling China required becoming something different from what the Mongols had always been. Break time 05's China was not the step. It could not be governed from horseback. It required bureaucracy, administration, the kind of patient institutional management that the Mongol tradition had never produced. Kublai Khan had built that. Imperfectly, controversially, over decades of effort, he had constructed the Yuan dynasty into something that functioned. He had kept the Mongol military identity while adopting enough Chinese administrative structure to govern 60 million people. His successors had done neither. In the 8 decades after Kublai Khan's death in 1294, the Yuan throne passed through 10 emperors. 10 in 80 years. Some reigned for months. Most died violently or were deposed by court factions. The military that had conquered China rotted from neglect. Break time equal 5s. The treasury that had funded the empire was drained by corruption and mismanagement. The floods of the Yellow River, which shifted course dramatically in the 1340s, destroying farmland across central China, were met not with the organized state response that a functional empire could have provided, but with paralysis. And then the plague arrived. The Black Death that devastated Europe in the 1340s had come from Central Asia, from the same steppe world the Mongols had ridden out of. It hit China first and hardest. Estimates suggest China lost between 1/3 and half of its population in the 14th century to plague, famine, and flood combined. The Yuan dynasty's response was inadequate, visibly, obviously, catastrophically inadequate. And the people who suffered most were not the Mongol ruling class. Protected in their cities, break time 05s, their courts, their administrative centers, the people who suffered most were the Chinese peasants, the farmers, the laborers, the men and women at the absolute bottom of a social order that the Yuan had made deliberately stratified. Mongols at the top, Central Asians second, Northern Chinese third, Southern Chinese last. Here is what that stratification produced, and this is the part that makes everything that follows possible. It produced Zhu Yuanzhang, born 1328 in Anhui province, lowest social class. His father, a tenant farmer who owned nothing, Not the land he worked, not the tools he used, not the future of the children he raised. When the plague and famine of 1344 came through their village, it took his father, his mother, and his eldest brother within weeks. Zhu was 16. He had no money for burial. Break time 05s. He begged a neighbor for a scrap of land to bury his family in. The neighbor refused. He found a piece of ground eventually, wrapped the bodies in straw and buried them. Then he walked to the nearest Buddhist monastery and asked for food. The monastery took him in as a novice. Then the monastery ran out of food too. The famine was that complete, and sent its monks away to beg for themselves. For the next several years, Zhu Yuanzhang wandered the roads of central China, a teenage beggar in a dying empire. But here is what none of this explains yet: how a wandering beggar becomes the commander who ends Mongol rule. Because the distance between those two things is not just personal, it is historical. And the bridge between them is the moment China decided it had suffered enough. That moment had a name: the Red Turban Rebellion. Break time 05s. The Red Turban Rebellion began in 1351. It was not one movement, it was dozens: peasant uprisings, religious sects, warlord factions, regional strongmen, all erupting simultaneously across a China that had been pushed past the point of endurance. The Yuan government responded with the only tool it had left: military force, which might have worked if the military had not spent 80 years rotting from neglect. It did not work. Zhu Yuanzhang joined the rebellion in 1352. He was 24 years old. He joined not out of ideology, not out of political vision, not out of any particular hatred for the Mongols. He joined because a friend wrote him a letter saying the rebel camp had food. That is how the man who would end Mongol rule in China entered history, following the smell of a meal. What happened next defies simple explanation. Break time 05s, because Zhu Yuanzhang had something that cannot be taught and cannot be inherited: the ability to make people believe in him, completely, unreservedly. In a movement full of charismatic figures and ambitious warlords, he rose faster than any of them. Within years, he commanded his own forces. Within a decade, he controlled southern China's most strategically important territories. He did it through two qualities that rarely exist in the same person: ruthlessness and loyalty. He was ruthless about eliminating rivals, not slowly, not hesitantly, but with the decisive speed of a man who understood that hesitation in his position was death. And he was loyal, genuinely, demonstrably loyal, to the men who served him well. Shu Da, his greatest general, had been his childhood friend from the same desperately poor village. Liu Bowen, break time .05s, his greatest strategist, was a scholar who had served the Yuan and switched sides because he recognized in Zhu something the Yuan no longer had: the ability to win. But winning China required more than military skill. It required eliminating the other warlords who stood between Zhu and the north, and the most dangerous of them was Chen Yuliang. Chen controlled the Yangtze River Valley, the economic heart of southern China. He commanded a fleet that dwarfed anything Zhu possessed. In 1363, he moved against Zhu with a force somewhere between 600,000 and 650. Soon men on the water, massive tower ships that functioned as floating fortresses, a naval armada that should have been completely, utterly unstoppable. Zhu had approximately 200,000. They met on Lake Poyang in August 1363. Break time 5s. What followed was the largest naval battle in human history. Larger than Trafalgar, larger than Lepanto, larger than any engagement ever fought on water before or since. For nearly 3 months, the two fleets fought across the lake. Fire ships, arrow storms, boarding actions in the smoke and confusion of burning vessels on open water. Here is what nobody tells you about Lake Poyang. Zhu was losing. For weeks, he was losing. His smaller ships could not engage Chen's tower fortresses directly. His men were dying in numbers that would have broken most commanders. There was a moment, recorded in the sources with the particular care that historians reserve for things that almost destroyed the future, when Zhu's own flagship ran aground and had to be abandoned under fire. He transferred to another ship and kept fighting. Break time 5s. The turning point came not from superior numbers or superior tactics, but from weather and fire. Zhu's commanders loaded smaller vessels with combustible materials, waited for the wind to shift, and sent them into Chen's fleet. The tower ships, massive, slow, difficult to maneuver, could not escape. The fire spread. The battle that had been going against Zhu for weeks turned in an afternoon. Chen Yuliang died in the battle, struck by an arrow, the man whose superior numbers should never have allowed him to lose. Lake Poyang made Zhu Yuanzhang the dominant power in southern China. It also confirmed something about him that his enemies had not understood and his allies had always known. He did not break. Under pressure that would have destroyed most commanders, facing odds that rational calculation said were unsurvivable, break time 05s, he kept making decisions. He kept fighting. He kept finding the next thing to try. The man who had buried his parents in straw did not know how to stop. Within 4 years of Lake Poyang, the rival warlords were gone. On January 23, 1368, Zhu Yuanzhang declared the founding of the Ming Dynasty and took the title Hongwu Emperor. Then he turned north, and Toghon Temür, the last Yuan emperor, sitting in Dadu with an empire that existed mostly in name, began to understand what was coming. Stay with me, because what happens next is not the battle most people expect, and that is exactly what makes it the most revealing moment of the entire story. The night before Xu Da's forces reached the outskirts of Dadu in the summer of 1368 was not a night of preparation in the Yuan court. It was a night of departure. Break time 05s, Toghon Temür had been receiving reports for months. City after city in northern China falling to Ming forces, not always through battle, often through surrender. Local commanders making the calculation that the Yuan was finished and accommodation with the Ming was survivable. He had grown up in Dadu. He had been emperor since 1333, 35 years on the dragon throne, longer than any Yuan emperor since Kublai Khan himself. The palace complex around him was the center of the world as he understood it. The libraries, the gardens, the court that had formed everything he knew about power and civilization. He ordered the court to prepare to leave. The sources record that he wept, not performing grief, actually wept. A man who had ruled the most populous nation on earth for 35 years. Break time 05s, leaving through the northern gate of his own capital. Because the alternative was a siege he could not win. Taking what could be carried, leaving what could not, he rode north, toward the steppe, toward the world his ancestors had ridden from a century before. He did not look back. In the Ming camp outside the city, Xu Da prepared his forces for entry. He had given explicit orders: no looting, no violence against civilians, no destruction of the city's infrastructure. The people of Dadu had suffered enough. They would not suffer at the hands of the Ming. These were not the orders of a conqueror. They were the orders of an administrator, a man who understood that what came after the battle mattered as much as the battle itself. 2 men, 2 camps, one preparing to leave everything he had ever known. Break time 05's one preparing to enter it, and to do so in a way that announced what kind of empire was coming next. Stop for a moment. Before Xu Da enters Dadu, before the Yuan dynasty officially ends. Think about Toghon Temür riding north. He did not choose to be the last Yuan emperor. He did not choose to inherit a dynasty that a century of mismanagement had already hollowed out. He had ruled for 35 years, trying to hold together something that had been breaking apart since before he took the throne. Was he a coward for leaving without a fight? Or was he the only Yuan emperor clear-eyed enough to understand that the dynasty had already ended, and that dying in Dadu would only add his death to the wreckage without changing anything? Drop a comment. 1 word. Coward or realist. What do you think Toghon Temür was? Break time C05s, because I think the honest answer says more about us than it does about him. Xu Da entered Dadu on September 14, 1368. No battle, no siege, no final defense. The gates opened. The Ming army walked in. The capital of Mongol rule changed hands in a morning because the force that should have defended it had already left. No looting, no burning. Xu Da's orders held. The people of Dadu found the soldiers were not there to hurt them. The Yuan dynasty ended not with a battle cry but with an army walking quietly through an abandoned capital. Toghon Temür died on the steppe 2 years later. He never recovered his dynasty. 100 years of Mongol rule ended in a morning. Zhu Yuanzhang ruled until 1398. He rebuilt China, reformed the bureaucracy, restored Chinese institutions, and executed tens of thousands of people, officials, generals, break-time 05's men who had served him for decades. The paranoia beneath the ruthlessness, the orphan's terror of betrayal, surfaced fully once the external threats were gone. The man who ended Mongol rule could not stop fighting even when there was no one left to fight. The Mongols fell because they forgot what they were. They came from the steppe, conquered China, and became something neither steppe nor Chinese. The institution rotted before the armies arrived. Zhu Yuanzhang never forgot. He carried his poverty to the dragon throne and never put it down. That made him formidable. And it made him something the men around him feared more than the Mongols ever had. Power does not change what a man is. It reveals it. The Forbidden City still stands in Beijing, built by a dynasty founded by a boy who buried his parents in straw. When you imagine yourself as that boy, 16, no family, no food, no future, do you find a way forward? Subscribe to The Clash of Ancients, where the men history forgot matter as much as the ones it remembers. Share this with someone who thinks they know China's story. Leave a comment. Did the Mongols fall, or did they run out of reasons to stay? This has been The Clash of Ancients. Some thrones are built on what their founders survived, and some rulers never stop surviving, even when the war is over. And I will see you in the next one.